8 months into Israel's bombardment of Gaza, there appears to be still no end in sight. We've been taking a look at what happened on October 7th during the Hamas terror attacks. And part of looking at that day requires some uncomfortable realities. Here's one. During the October 7th attacks, what did the Israeli military do? Well, strangely enough, for hours, nothing. I'm investigative journalist Ben Swan, and this is Reckoning, Israel and Gaza. Before we dive into the evidence that suggests there was some type of military stand-down order on October 7th, it's important to remember that Israel is just slightly bigger than the size of the state of New Jersey. But for some reason, once the Hamas attacks began, the time it took the Israeli army and rescue teams to arrive, fight, and rescue Israelis at the different kibbutz communities and sites being attacked, well, that ranged anywhere from 4 hours to more than 20 hours. Even the New York Times has reported, quote, thousands of soldiers were less than 40 minutes from the towns that were under attack. So why did it take so long for help to arrive? For example, kibbutz Be'eri was under siege by Palestinian militants beginning around 6 a.m. That was the morning of October 7th. A video that Israeli media obtained from an army helicopter, corroborated by Israeli survivors, proves that there were more than 500 Israeli soldiers directly outside of the kibbutz entrance, fully armed with Humvees and tanks, but not until 4:30 in the afternoon. That's 10 hours after the attack began. It took 10 hours for those soldiers to show up, but it gets stranger because the first rescue mission wasn't actually underway at kibbutz Be'eri, again, according to Israeli media, until almost 7 p.m. That's 13 hours after the attack began. Atzival, a survivor of the Be'eri attack, described to Haaretz, quote, 500 soldiers stood outside with equipment and vehicles. I remember yelling at them, we're being slaughtered, come in, save us. And no one said anything. So why? In our last episode, we discussed the Nova Music Festival. We showed you that the party was approved last minute, despite multiple warnings of a violent incursion from Gaza. And we've discussed how days before the festival, 2 entire brigades of soldiers were taken away from the area of the Gaza border. And you might think that immediately upon receiving information of a devastating attack on partygoers, military authorities would alert units to immediately exit their bases, race to the site of the conflict, and go on the counterattack, right? But that's not what happened. Haaretz reported, quote, at 7 a.m., the party organizer called Lieutenant Colonel Elad Zendani, the man tasked with approving the festival, and told him that terrorists were shooting the partygoers. He suggested that they fend for themselves. The first IDF forces arrived at the party scene at 3 p.m. That's 8 hours for a response time for one of the most efficient, capable, and well-militarized security forces in the world, operating in a country the size of New Jersey, with their Gaza division only a few miles away. What makes it even more strange, around 4 hours into the Hamas assault at 10:46 a.m., Israel was already launching operations and bombing targets inside of Gaza. So hold on, let that sink in. If Israel could begin an offensive attack into Gaza within 4 hours, why did it take more than 6 hours? In most cases, more than 10 hours, and in some cases, 20 hours to mobilize inside their own country to stop the ongoing attack, to defend the lives of their own people. Jonathan Pollard is an Israeli-American. He's a former National Security Agency employee. He served 30 years in federal prison for giving classified information to Israel. Of course, you should always be skeptical of the claims of a former spy, but on a podcast, Pollard seems to suggest there was a military stand-down order in place on October 7th. And considering all the evidence, it makes sense.
I have friends who were helicopter pilots, attack pilots, who were sitting in their cockpits, ready to take off, fully loaded, ready to stop them at the fence. They didn't get their orders for 6 hours. They could hear it. They could hear the fighting. They were called by friends in the border kibbutzim in Mosavim that were being overrun and slaughtered, saying, help us, please. They're killing our children. They weren't given permission to take off. That will haunt my friends for the rest of his life.
The New York Times quoted Ben Zion, an Israeli military reservist who spoke to Israeli media. He said his unit voluntarily left central Israel in a convoy at 1:30 p.m. They got together and they left for the south on their own. He expected to see the roads packed with soldiers and equipment and armored vehicles heading south. Quote, the roads were empty, he recalled in an interview. Roughly 7 hours into the fighting, he turned to the reservists next to him and asked, where's the IDF? Now, we've thrown a lot of information at you here, so let's sum up the timeline. At 6 a.m., Hamas began their violent assault on southern Israel by launching hundreds of rockets and then breaching the border. At 10 a.m., the Israeli defense minister announced that Israel is at war. 30 minutes later, the Israeli military announced it was already identifying and bombing targets inside of Gaza. And from there, it took anywhere from 4 hours to 10 hours for army units to arrive, and then sometimes another 4 hours to 10 hours for them to actually engage the militants and begin to save Israelis. Between the trove of concrete evidence that suggests Israeli military allowed October 7th to happen by ignoring dozens of reliable and specific warnings, threatening soldiers with legal actions who tried to warn their military superiors, and taking troops away from the area of the Gaza border that was attacked, and now evidence that suggests there was some type of military stand-down order in place on October 7th, it's important to ask, what was October 7th? And what kind of war is the United States supporting?
אלפי מסמכים. כאן למעשה אנחנו רואים שבשנת 2018, שזה ממש לא מזמן, כן? השלימה רשות החברות הממשלתיות את ההפרטה. ההפרטה זה, הכוונה היא העברה לידיים פרטיות. ההפרטה המלאה של הצבא הישראלי חזר בעלות פרטית, הנה תסתכלו, התעשייה בע"מ, אתם רואים? הנה, על ידי, נכון?
על ידי הקמת חברה ממשלתית חדשה, שאליה הפעילות המכוונת העסקית של ישראל, תעשיות צבאיות הועברו, והחברה הממשלתית החדשה נמכרה במכירה פרטית למשקיע.
אין שם של משקיע כמובן, כן?